Good afternoon, good morning, and maybe it's good evening to some of you. Thank you very much for joining the webinar today. This is the first of a series of webinar on DRR and resilience. Today's topic will be Introduction to Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience. And just for your information, we will have another webinar on the 20th of April, and the topic will be Introduction to the Sendai Framework. On the 25th of May, Sustainability and Resilience. 22nd of June, Sendai Framework and Risk Reduction. And the last one will be on the 20th of July, Forecast-based financing. We have this lineup of interesting webinars, and we would really encourage you all to join. The webinar series was designed primarily for the ADRA network, but we are very honored and happy that we have participants from other organizations as well. We welcome you. Thank you very much for being with us, and we hope you will be with us in the future as well. My name is Prabuk Bandaratilaka. I work for the ADRA's Asia Regional Office. Through the session, we would like to ask you to keep your mics mute and videos turned off. However, you can use the chat box to share any question that you have. And I will read it out loud and have that conversation with the presenter. We don't want you to wait until the end if you have questions. As and when they arise, go ahead and type it in the chat box, and we will ask it from the presenter so that it could be more of a dialogue. The webinar series is designed to start from the basics and then go to a little bit more advanced topics. So we hope that it will be a really good learning experience for everyone, no matter at what level capacity you are. Let me quickly introduce you to the speaker. His name is Mr. Stefan. He has become now a good friend of ours. He actually started his work in South Africa and worked for the government before he moved into Australia and worked for a private company. Later on in his life, he joined ARUP, and he was in charge of infrastructure projects in Maldives, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, South Sudan, in many countries. In 2014, he was appointed as the head of DRR and resilience programs in UNOPS, and he was actually a speaker at the Sendai Conference. Currently, he is the country representative for UNOPS in Bangladesh, and we are very honored and grateful that he has set aside some time towards this webinar, and we know that we will be able to learn from him, but at the same time learn from each other as well. Before I pass on the time to Stefan, let me ask Mark Webster, who is the regional director for ADRA's regional director for the Asia region, to offer the opening prayer, and then Stefan, you can take over immediately. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Prabuk. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, thank you for the blessing we have of being able to come together on this platform and learn together. It's not something we take for granted. I ask that you will bless those here and our teams around the world who are currently working on disaster risk reduction and resilience, and that you'll bless all that they do and all that we learn here today in your name. Amen.
Stefan, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mark and Prabuk, and thank you very much for the welcome. And just before I kick off, I suppose just by way of introduction, a little bit more of a context for myself, just so that you're aware. My speciality is not particularly in disaster management or in the kind of response space. Most of my career has been working very much in the development sector and in the infrastructure space. So, and I realize there are people here who probably have more experience in the disaster space than I do, but I think that's fine. And you'll see as we progress through the discussions that what we're doing in the development space is particularly relevant for this conversation. When I worked in Copenhagen at UNOPS as head of the DRR program, I actually worked very closely with a disaster management specialist, and I realized how the two of these pieces actually fit very nicely together. but we'll go through that a bit more in more detail. The way I've approached this, and it was something I did when I started at UNOPS, was realize that there's a kind of plethora of language and words that people use, which can be particularly confusing. And also, coming very much from an engineering background, I like to work from what we call first principles. So bear with me, because we're going to start with what perhaps may seem like very basic terminology and concepts, but I think it's important we get the foundations right. So when we start with this, you'll see that the language becomes particularly important, and particularly the underlying concepts, because as we know, you can very easily get distracted and go what we call off-piste or in the wrong direction when we talk about some of these concepts. And dare I say, working in the UN, I've seen a lot of this and seen a lot of sort of confusion. So trying to bring some clarity to this is part of the intention of this. I really enjoy doing these seminars because I think we learn all the time. So please, let's keep this interactive. As Prabhu said, if you have questions, comments, please feel free to interrupt me. Please feel free to put something in the chat box, and then Prabhu can just ask and we can deal with questions. So let's try and keep it interactive as possible. So I'm going to share my screen, everybody now, and if somebody could just confirm that you can see the slides, that would be great.
Yes, we can see it, Stefan.
Okay, all right, thank you. So let's jump in, and I realize time-wise we probably have just under an hour, so I'll try not to talk too long, and that we can then ask questions and share. So the outline of sort of what we're going to go through is a little bit, and I've looked at the outline that was in the schedule, and we'll talk just very briefly on the history of DRR and resilience, and I think most people are familiar with that. And then a lot of it will be around this definitions, because I think that's quite a critical piece. And I'll talk you through how those definitions have come about and how they link together and why the wording of them is so important. And then we can have a discussion around sort of examples on DRR and resilience, and then contrasting the two, what it is not, and a question I'll pose for you at the end of this that will perhaps lead into discussion for the next sessions. Coming from an infrastructure background, I always particularly like this, this picture when we talk about disaster risk reduction and resilience. It's a picture of what is known as the Bell Rock Lighthouse. But the point of this is that it was built in the 1800s, between 1807 and 1810. And this is not a very old structure in world terms when we think of some of the things that are out there. But when we talk about risk reduction and resilience, the concept has been around for a long time, because clearly the engineer who designed this knew exactly what this lighthouse was going to have to withstand in order for it to function. So when we talk about the history, often we only think in terms of the sort of timelines that we see here, which started in the 1960s with the UN and the General Assembly with their first sort of, I guess, foray into the world of disasters. A lot of this is on the UN DRR website, so I won't read through it in great detail, but you can see there's sort of been a development over time from looking and managing disasters, working with natural disasters, and then going into a decade for natural disaster reduction, then sort of disasters vulnerability, setting up the ISDR. And then the two major documents that I think everybody is familiar with. First was the Hyogo Framework, which was the global blueprint for disaster reduction. And that was relevant from 2005 to 2015. And what's important there was the goal to substantially reduce disaster losses. And we'll see how this has kind of evolved over time. And then clearly the latest document, which is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which runs from 2015 to 2030. So it's a 15-year agreement. And what's important is that this is a voluntary document, and it's actually owned by the states because they have the primary role for reducing what they call disaster risk. So it's not actually the UN, or it's not NGOs or others who kind of are responsible, but it is the government, the state, that has the primary role in this function. Though having said that, you can see the role should be shared with other stakeholders, which includes local government, private sector, and other stakeholders, obviously such as yourselves. A lot of this you can read on the UN DRR website, so I won't go through it in detail, but you can see there's a progression over time of how these concepts have been sort of built and developed. What I want to do now is, I guess, take a little bit of a step back and do some of the boring stuff perhaps, and look at some of the language, because I think that's where this all starts, and that's what I very quickly realized when I started delving into this in a lot more detail when I was working with this with UNOPS. I guess I can also add here that the reflections and things I want to share with you sort of come from a practitioner's perspective. I don't profess to be an academic. I've spent enough time at the universities, but this is very much built on sort of practical application, which I think is often missing. There's a lot of academic theorizing around things, but what does this mean in practical terms? So what we've talked through now comes very much from a sort of a practitioner perspective, and people asking the question, so how do we apply the Sendai Framework? What does it mean? How do we do this? Which is always the key question for us. So let's start with this word disasters. And I think it's good to revisit it, because you hear this word used a lot. And you'll soon see these words are often used interchangeably. So let's start with this word. And you can see some definitions there. And I like the one that's come from the IFRC about the disaster being this calamitous event that seriously disrupts the functioning of a community or society, causes human, material, and economic or environmental loss. And I think the key concept that comes out of this is this idea that there's something that exceeds the community or the society's ability to cope. And then the sentence, it's often caused by nature, but disasters can have human origins. Now, why this is important, because you will hear the people saying a disaster equates to an event. So the cyclone is a disaster. The truth is the cyclone is not the disaster. The cyclone is actually just a cyclone. But what happens is the cyclone interacts with the community. It interacts with your infrastructure. And if that community and that infrastructure doesn't have the coping mechanisms, and it's not able to cope with that event, you have a serious disruption, which becomes a disaster. So it's quite important, this, because I think people use this word very loosely, but we really need to understand the cyclone is not the disaster. The earthquake is not the disaster. Okay, it's when it causes the disruption that becomes the disaster. And this idea of exceeding the coping capacity. We'll talk a bit more about that. So that's, I think, one of the key concepts from this point here. The next term to run through quickly is this idea of disaster management. And again, a definition from IFRC, which is it's the management and organization of resources and responsibilities for dealing with humanitarian aspects of emergencies. So it talks about preparedness, response, and recovery to lessen the impact of disasters. Now, often this focuses on events when something has happened and there has been this major damage or loss of life. Then you are dealing with an emergency. So it's dealing with emergencies. What you see out of this is it's quite reactive. So it's actually dealing with the disaster. And again, that's quite important because we'll build on these concepts as we go through the discussion. So this starts looking at things like preparedness, response, and recovery to lessen the impact of the disaster. And those impacts are often people are without shelter, people are without food, people are without water, and it's trying to be prepared to lessen the impact of the disaster. Okay, so we're good so far with disaster and disaster management. Then we have disaster risk reduction. Now this is starting to become a bit more proactive and talking about actions you take before a hazard, and I like this where they say hazard or disaster. Now this is where it starts becoming interesting because, as I said earlier, the cyclone you could see as the hazard. It's not yet a disaster. And we'll talk a bit more about the distinction between these things. But what you're trying to do is reduce the impact of these events. And that's where you start doing some preparatory work and you take actions before something happens. And you want to reduce the impact, which is similar to disaster management. It's about reducing the impact of the hazard. This is also often referred to as disaster risk management. But one thing to point out here is the focus in this kind of concept is often about the word disaster. So it's actions we take before the disaster. And I'll move on to the next topic, which is shifting our focus to this word risk. I think this is one of the key elements of this whole discussion. And it's an area that, and with due respect to everyone in the room, I think it's an area that's often poorly understood about risk. We often use the word quite glibly, and we talk about risks this and risks that. But if we go back and understand what is risk all about, ISO 31000 is a document, a global standard that actually defines risk. And this is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. The way we usually express risk, it's a combination of a hazard, and you can see this word hazard coming through the thread of the discussion already, the likelihood of that hazard occurring, and then the consequence. So when you combine those things, that's when we start talking about risk. And this is quite critical to understand that if we talk and think about our cyclone, the cyclone is the hazard. Okay? And then we have to understand what is the likelihood of that cyclone occurring and what are the consequences of that cyclone. And that's when we understand risk. And that's when we start talking about what are the things that we can do to change the risk. Now we can do a combination of things. We could either remove the hazard, we can change the likelihood of the hazard occurring, or we can change the consequences. Now again, if we think of our cyclone concept, can we change a cyclone? Can we alter the hazard, or can we remove the hazard? I think the answer to that is no. Can we change the likelihood of the hazard occurring? Probably not. So the only thing we can really do is change the consequences. Just reflect on that for a moment, because I think it's quite important when we move further into the discussion about what we do with certain, and understanding what the hazards are, what is the likelihood of them occurring, and then what are the consequences. And that's where we talk about sort of risk reduction in risk management terms, is when you actively do things that start changing either the hazard, the likelihood of it occurring, or the consequences of it. And sometimes you can't eliminate these things completely. And that's when we have this term residual risk. That is the risk that's left over after you've implemented a risk treatment option. Now, I won't have a whole discourse on risk management because it's a whole science all on its own, but just so that you understand some of the terms and where they come from. And I'll start drawing these threads together in a bit more detail. And just to introduce the concept now, that generally in resilience language, you'll hear the word shocks and stresses. And those kind of equate to hazards. So shocks and stresses can also be your hazards, same sort of thing. Shocks are obviously things that happen in a short period of time and can be quite sudden. Again, an earthquake can be a shock. A cyclone lasts for a very short time, happens very quickly. And obviously the stresses are things that occur over a longer period of time. Subsequent droughts in 3 or 4 or 5 years can be a stress and can have a much longer term effect and occur more slowly. But in risk terms, we would see those all as hazards that you have to deal with. Are we good? I don't know if there are any questions per book from anyone on this, but I'm happy to pause if people have any questions or want to discuss anything.
Sure, Stefan. There are no questions in the chat box, and I would encourage, if at all anyone has questions, to go ahead and post them. But I have a question for you, and this is about the equation on the slide, Stefan.
Yes.
It says risk equals to hazard or event into likelihood into consequence. I've also seen this equation which adds another element which says divided by community's capacity to respond or community's capacity. Have you come across that equation as well?
Look, I have, and also the term vulnerability comes into that. So this is expressed in various ways. What I've gone here is gone back to the ISO definition. And that's why I say people have created various versions of this to suit the kind of the context that they're using it in. The vulnerability is actually a function of the likelihood of the consequence occurring. Because don't forget risk, I think where people also get confused, risk is, it's a kind of predicative assessment of what could happen. So you're looking at the likelihood of a hazard occurring. How likely is this to occur? Is it, and there's various ways of doing that, either what they call quantitatively, where you can measure it and say a flood will occur, and they use these terms, a 1 in 10 year return, or a 1 in 20 year, or 1 in 30 year flood. And then what would the consequence of that be? And you sometimes can reduce that to a number and say the consequence would be, 500 people could die and it could cost X million dollars. But that's what we call the sort of raw risk before you've done anything. When you talk about the community's ability to cope, that starts talking to vulnerability, because that says, if this happens, what would the consequence be? And if the community can't cope, the consequence is obviously very different to when a community can cope. And as I said earlier, if we're talking about something like a cyclone, your ability to change the nature of the hazard, to change the likelihood of it occurring, is almost zero. So the only thing you can do is actually change the consequence. Where you can say, I can lessen the impact that this is going to have. I can lessen the effect that this event is going to have. And that's when you can start talking about coping capacity. And we'll come to that in a bit more detail in general, because that becomes
sure
a part of the resilience discussion.
Right. There is one question actually.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, there's a question in the chat box, and it says, how do we decide when a slow coming drought becomes a disaster?
If you go back to our definition of disaster, an event that seriously disrupts the functioning of a community and that causes human, material, economic, or environmental loss. So if you have persistent drought, you might be able to survive for 1 year with minimal kind of loss of life or impact because you have food stored up. The second year, those food supplies have been deleted, the impact is going to be much greater. And you're going to start having severe deaths. Then you're starting to talk about a disaster. So the disaster talks to this coping capacity and what will the impact be? What is the consequence? So if we come back to our risk definition, your hazard is your drought. And if the likelihood of it persisting is high, over time, the consequence can change. It's not a static thing. You may not just have one consequence. And you'll see how this becomes relevant in the resilience discussion, that when you start predicting things over time, you can see how the effect, what effect it's going to have. And
Thanks,
because
Stefan.
you may
There's
not be able to hear. Okay.
Go ahead, you can finish. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, and because again, I reiterate, you may not be able to prevent the drought, but you can alter the consequence. So that's how you would reduce the risk. Yes.
Thanks, Stefan. There's a question, and this is from Reem. He says, can you please reflect more on the man-made disasters, and as they are quite often underrepresented in DRR and resilience discussions? For example, in the risk equation, hazards and the likelihood can be more mitigated by man-made disasters like conflict.
Absolutely, and I think you're right. I think there is a tendency, that's why I like going back to this definition, because we tend to substitute hazard with climatic events or natural events. And we say, and to be quite honest, we'll talk a bit about this a bit more, but we talk about natural disasters. I come from a perspective where I say there is no such thing, and I'll explain why. But yes, when you focus on the hazard, you have to understand what is the nature of that hazard? Is it a man-made hazard? And what is the likelihood of it occurring? So conflict is a big one. And, we can think of places like Yemen, and you say conflict is and the likelihood is high that this is going to occur. The parts of the world where COVID, for example, we could say was potentially, if we understand the sources of it, was a man-made hazard. And the spread of it, clearly through travel, etc., is man-made. So how do we focus on man-made hazards? Can be very tricky as well to change the nature of those hazards and to alter them. So the hazard is not always that clear-cut. But certainly I think in the development world, we are often conscious of doing things that will exacerbate man-made hazards. And I suppose a typical example of that is where you could be working in a sensitive area and you start building roads, for example, thinking you're improving connectivity with communities. What in fact you end up doing is allowing military personnel to move around areas much quicker. So if there is going to be a military intervention, you've contributed to that hazard through the construction of a road. So you've increased the risk, which is problematic. So, how we address this, I think it's the way we view these things. And like I said, in my experience, most of the discussion is always around natural hazards. We often don't think of the man-made hazards. And there are many of them if you actually think about it.
Thanks, Stefan. I think you addressed the next question already. I'm going to read it out nevertheless. Yeah. It's from Imran. Can you please reflect on how does this equation function in terms of conflict and social unrest? Let me also go to the next question so that, just to have it all in. So the consequences, in other words, could be said that it depends on how vulnerability and how the communities cope with the situation or the capacity. It's a question.
Correct. So that's why I like this equation, because I think when we design interventions to reduce risk, we can focus very clearly on what are we doing. Are we either reducing or increasing the hazard, or are we working on the consequence, or are we doing both? So in terms of, as I just explained, in terms of, exacerbating the hazard, sometimes interventions can increase the likelihood of a man-made hazard, a conflict. And there are many examples of that where we're sort of, in the development world, inequitable development or inequitable access to resources can increase the likelihood of the hazard, which would be, let's say, conflict. And by increasing the likelihood of that hazard, you've increased the risk. And often this is unintentional because people are not aware that they're changing the hazard. They're changing the likelihood, that the hazard is going to occur. And then on the other side of the equation is the consequence, correct? So what is the effect going to be? And if we can't change the hazard, are we going to change the consequence? That's why, as I said, it's important in thinking about our interventions. Are we working on the hazard or the consequence or both? I hope that answers the question, but it's an interesting discussion and we can talk a bit more about that. And people can just think about that in what they're doing.
Thanks, Stefan. No more questions at the moment, but
okay.
If there's something that comes up, I will interrupt. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so what I want to try and do now is start tying some of these things together so that we can sort of get into the discussion on resilience. But what I'm hearing and what I'm really thinking is very positive is, people are starting to think about this in risk terms, because that's really the key to this whole discussion. What I want to do is just illustrate something here graphically, as sort of good engineers do, and a term that I've sort of borrowed actually from the world of business. And I think we've all heard of this term, business continuity, which is essentially the idea that if you have a business, let's say a business that manufactures pencils, but you're importing wood from one part of the world and you're importing, what used to be the lead, but now the graphite in the pencils from another part of the world, and you've got a factory that's assembling the pencils and then you're distributing them around the world. In the world of business continuity, what you do is you have a plan that says, if my supply chain gets interrupted, or if my executive board dies in a plane crash, heaven forbid, or if something happens that's going to disrupt my business, what am I going to do? Do I have a plan? But the key to this is that you don't spend your time managing the plan, you spend your time managing the business. but you have the plan and you continually update the plan so that when something does happen, you're ready to ensure that your business doesn't fall over. Now, when we were thinking about this, I took this analogy further and said, okay, so if I was a government, what is my core business? If we think about the core business of government, and we kind of distilled it down to this idea that the core business of a government or a state is to ensure the continued development of that state and ensure that whatever happens, you have development continuity, that you don't have something that's going to majorly throw you off course. And I think COVID has highlighted this concept very clearly in the last year. So the way we tried to illustrate this was saying we have a development pathway. So over time, we're undertaking activities, we're doing things, the country's developing. We then have a shock or a stress that occurs. And in this case, we use a shock to illustrate the red dot. Now, generally what happens when you have a shock is this is what we call a loss of development gains. So if you think back to this word disaster and you think back to exceeding coping capacity, you have damage, you have things, infrastructure gets broken, you have loss of life. Those are all development gains which are lost. Basically destruction, that's the disaster. Then you have this period of recovery where you sort of put things back together and you try and get back on track. I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. And then hopefully you're going to get back onto your development trajectory or your development pathway. So that's sort of generally what happens. What we try and do in the sort of, even in the business continuity world or in the development continuity world, what we should be doing is saying we want to develop on the pathway or we want to improve. But what we're actually trying to do is reduce this loss that occurs. We want to prevent the losses. We want to get back on our development pathway as quickly as possible or move on to this new development pathway as quickly as possible. Let's kind of unpack a little bit the different elements of this and link them back to the words and the terminology that we've been talking about. So first of all, when we talk about the depth of the curve or how much loss will occur, that's very much a function of what we call the resistance capacity or your coping capacity. How much stress or how much shock can you cope with before you break is essentially the word. And the disaster is when the systems break. We have what we call catastrophic failure. If the systems don't break, they are stressed, but they're not broken. We don't really have a loss of those development gains. But up to a point, and when they do break, that's when we have this loss of development gains. And that's what we call your resistance capacity. And I usually use this term around the built environment, which is all the infrastructure you see, and it includes the social structures, the social systems, the social safety nets, the governance mechanisms, because often in a event or a shock or a stress, for example, in Haiti, you had a complete collapse of government when the Haiti earthquake hit for various reasons. But the resistance capacity of the built environment was very low. And therefore you had a major loss of development gains. The next part of this is how quickly do we recover? how quickly can we get back onto our original or an improved development pathway? And that's known as the adaptive capacity. So how do we adapt to this? And again, I use this word, the built environment, but it's how quickly do our systems recover and get back on track. And then lastly is, do we actually learn something? Do we move on from what was our original development pathway and we actually are able to reflect and learn something and move on to what perhaps is a more improved development pathway? And that's what I refer to as the build back better kind of gap. Are we actually learning something? So you'll see in here the terms resistance, adaptive, and reflective capacity. Now, what we talked about earlier in terms of hazard and consequence in risk language, your resistance capacity is actually nothing more than a function of the risk that's inherent in your system. Because clearly, the higher the risk, the bigger the losses are going to occur. So what we can see is that we now start talking about the word resilience, and we'll define that a bit more. But essentially, if you reduce the risks, you start increasing the resilience. And these risks can sit in a number of areas: geographic, social, political, economic. There's a whole bunch of them. We won't go through them. But if we can reduce those and we can improve our ability to withstand the shocks and stresses, and these are things that are coming from the environment, then we can improve the resilience. So what it's leading to is a kind of definition of resilience. Now, I'm not sure how useful it is to try and get hung up on a specific definition of resilience. And there's many of them about. I think what's important, or what I've kind of thought about, is the fact that there's certain key concepts in here that we should be understanding rather than getting hung up on words of a definition. So what I've done is highlighted those in red. And you'll see the ISDR, or what is now UNDRR definition, a definition from a UK National Infrastructure Plan. And what we're talking about is this exposure to hazards or exposure to shocks and stresses, and then this ability to anticipate them or resist them, to absorb them, adapt, and recover. If you think back to our, sorry if I jump back to our graphic, it's about this ability to resist them, to adapt to them, and then to recover and learn from them. So that's the kind of key concept we need to get to in the resilience discussion. Now, if we think back to where we started on the discussions around sort of disaster management, disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction, what I see is this word risk tends to get diminished and the word disaster gets focused on. And we'll as I said, we'll have more of a discourse on that. But if we think of this in terms of risk, then it's quite easy to see how we need to understand what are the hazards and how likely are they to occur, and then what is the likely consequence. And can the systems or the communities or the structures resist? Can they absorb and can they accommodate that hazard or that shock and stress? And how fast can they recover from it? I think that's sort of the key concept around resilience. The other point I want to make on this is that risk is not a static thing. Okay, and I see this in the development sector a lot. People talk about risk management and they develop a risk management plan and they put it on the shelf and they never look at it again. But what we need to understand is that risk is completely dynamic. It can change day by day, almost, when you're tracking a cyclone, it changes hour by hour. So the critical thing here for me in this is this is what I would call a state of being, rather than a static, that's what it is. In the disaster management world, often disaster managers will prepare their disaster management plans, they will do their drills, but then they wait for something to happen before they implement those plans. Sure, they do update them and they do sort of checks and they do drills and they test them, but ultimately it's quite a static scenario. Once we move into the resilience world, it becomes very dynamic because these things are continually changing. And I sort of equate this to one's personal health, where we're saying, my health is a dynamic thing. It continually changes. It's not something that you do for a day and then you're good for the next 20 years. You've got to manage it and monitor it constantly. So if we think back around this idea of disaster risk reduction versus resilience, people who've worked in this, maybe now you can reflect on some of the examples and we can talk a little bit about how they are different or how are they similar, which helps us start working with some of these concepts. I'll pause there again.
May I ask a...
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes. Sorry. May I have just a quick question? On the graph that you showed before, we used the word resistance capacity, adaptive capacity. Now, I understand in the field of engineering, you may have some ways to measure the resistance capacity of a certain product, a material. When it comes to the communities, organizations, is there some index, is there some a system in place to measure this persistent capacity rather than waiting for an actual disaster and then for us to say, okay, they had a good capacity or not?
So some work has been done on this. There is a document that was done, and I think it's on the IFRC website. I can share a link with you, which talks about sort of safe and resilient communities. What are the characteristics of a safe and resilient community? There's also been a lot of work done with the Rockefeller Foundation on resilient cities, looking at what we call the characteristics of resilient cities and communities. And there was some attempt to develop some indicators, but there's some very good characteristics that I think help a lot in looking at what do we need to do to improve the resistance capacity. and the core of that is obviously what they call a knowledgeable and healthy community. And knowledge is a key area there. So how aware is the community of the context they're living in, of the consequences, of the hazards? How aware are they of everything around them is a key function. Then there's sort of other characteristics that sit around those that talk about things like what are the natural and infrastructure assets that community has at their disposal? What is their connectivity to sort of leadership structures, to response agencies? What does the leadership of the community look like? So there's a lot of characteristics There are a number of them that are quite key in this that have come out of the research, and I can share that, the links to those documents, but you can find it on the IFRC website. It was done a couple of years ago now, but I think it's still very relevant in terms of understanding what are the characteristics of a resilient community. This work has been done at community level, at city level, not yet, I believe, translated to national level, but I think it's quite easily translatable. If you start thinking about the environment you're in and what makes you resilient.
Thanks, Stefan. Thank you very much.
So if we come back to this, anyone want to make any comment? I think this is quite important for the discussion that we'll be having, I think, in the next session on the sort of Sendai framework. And I guess one of the key differences for me here is that, as I said earlier, that disaster risk reduction has tended very much to focus on the disaster word rather than the risk component of it. And we'll talk a bit more in detail on that. I think they're similar in that disaster risk reduction is, as we saw in the definition earlier, is trying to become more proactive in this space, is trying to start thinking ahead rather than just a sort of disaster management viewpoint where once the disaster happens, then we have to manage it. So we're trying to move beyond waiting for something to happen. But even in the preparedness space, I think for me that is still very much focused on disaster management, as it were, preparing for the disaster. Resilience, I think, goes beyond that. If we come back to these definitions, if you start thinking about what do we do to anticipate, to absorb and adapt, and how do we recover? And that's what the Sendai Framework tries to do, is to move more into that proactive space rather than just being reactive to these things. Everybody's very quiet on this. Any more comment, questions? Does it make sense?
Yes, Stefan. I think Reem has shared some examples on the chat box as well. So everyone, you're welcome to click on those links that Reem had shared. I think we can proceed.
Okay, so I'm virtually at the end. So there was just one to consider when we start thinking about the next discussion. Clearly, if we want things to be 100% resilient, it can be infinitely expensive or difficult to do that. But by the same token, major failures are also very expensive. And it's not just infrastructure failures, but when we think about community failures and we think of loss of life, loss of livelihoods, they have major economic consequences. So those things become very expensive. But clearly, there's a finite amount of resources that we have available to design these interventions. So we need to find this balance between cost and resilience. How much resilience can we achieve? That's why I call it a state of being, because I don't think it's not an outcome in itself. It's not an end state. It's something that is ongoing. And because risk changes, your resilience changes constantly as well. So we need to find this balance between, where do we want to get to and what are the interventions and how much does that cost? But a question I'd like to leave you with to think about is this issue of where does the responsibility for resilience lie? Who is responsible for it? The Sendai Framework does talk about placing it firmly with the state, and the states are the owners of the document. They co-created it and they signed up and agreed to it. It does talk about a shared responsibility between various stakeholders, local level, national level. But perhaps something to reflect on, and those of you who are working in countries or are familiar with this, is just to think a little bit about who in the countries kind of owns the Sendai Framework. Who in the countries is responsible for reporting on the Sendai Framework? And then who is responsible for implementing it? Because as I said at the beginning, this is very much about the practical considerations of what we're doing. And as a teaser for the next session that I hope you'll be able to join, we'll try and unpack this a little bit more and we talk in more detail about the Sendai Framework. But it becomes a very key question around who is responsible for resilience. So I'll stop there. We have a few minutes left. So if there are any questions,
Thanks.
Discussion.
Steph, Herbert has made a comment. He says, so good disaster management is not what we do when it happens, but what we do before it happens in order to get us ready to cope with it.
Yes. The question I have in response to that is what activities do you focus on in order to prepare? How do you decide what should be done when you're preparing? Because we can do activities. Do we know what we're preparing for? Or we say, yes, we're preparing for a cyclone. And then the next question is, if you go back to our risk discussion on hazard and consequence, if we're preparing for a cyclone, can we change the hazard? If the answer is no, then the activity should focus on changing the consequence. But how many of those consequences can you actually change, and which consequences? Because it can have multiple consequences. There's often, and I should have, I suppose, highlighted that, there can be one hazard which has multiple consequences. And then we have to think about those consequences and what can we do to change them? Because some of the consequences you may not be able to change. I'll just leave you to think about that as well.
Thanks, thanks, Stefan. I think I'm not sure whether there's anyone in the group here who wants to unmute themselves and share some thoughts on that. We have 2 more minutes to go, but you're welcome to do it.
But please, because as a learning experience, it's about the discourse. So I'm sharing my thoughts and ideas. I'm not the oracle on this, but I think it's good to be challenged and because I think this is often what's missing in the space is the kind of fundamental debate about some of these issues. And let's not be scared to debate them.
Okay, seems like there's no one unmuting themselves.
Hi, sorry, just a question. I guess I'm a brave soul. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. So my name is Siobhan Sherman, and I'm currently in the Bahamas. I'm from the Bahamas, where we are very much accustomed to hurricanes. And while I say that, I also want to say that we also have a laissez-faire approach, I think, as a community, because we are so accustomed to hurricanes when it comes to preparation. And I think that really shone in the last hurricane that struck us in 2019, Hurricane Dorian. And so what our office is trying to do now is prepare a DRR plan. And so I think my biggest question is, how do we begin to create a paradigm shift and show the importance of resilience over dealing with it after the fact, just trying to pick up the remnants as opposed to building differently, cleaning differently around, paying more attention to our neighbors and so on. How can we begin to assist our community in realizing the importance of resilience? I think that's my key question, if you do have any thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan, and a very good question. I like that, because I think that actually is the key question around Sendai. So what does Sendai mean? How do we translate this into that very practical action? But also, I think a point you highlighted very importantly is the kind of cultural shift, the thinking shift that is required. Because as you rightly say, and we see this in other countries where communities who live in the proximity of volcanoes, for example, have the same laissez-faire attitude. Oh, we deal with this every day, so what? I hopefully will answer that in the next session, where we actually have developed a framework that helps very much implement the Sendai Framework, and sort of unpacks the different components of it and what you can do in those different areas that you can then use to start that discussion, and then to start developing a plan that will help you build resilience, which is what this is all about. And as I said, it's a building resilience exercise. So I'm dodging your question a little bit without preempting what we want to talk in the next session, and hopefully you'll be able to join us, where we can talk through a framework that we've developed that addresses that. And it's based on the Sendai Framework and the practical steps you can take around each of those sort of elements of the Sendai Framework. And you can translate this from national government level right down to community level. So yes, we do have some very clear thoughts on how this should be done. So I hope that helps. It doesn't answer your question directly, but we'll cover that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Siobhan. And I'm sure, well, we would like for you to join together with others for the next session. That's all the time we have for today. Stefan, thank you very much for the thought-provoking presentation, for the discussion. And we hope to have another interesting session on the 20th of April. The topic will be Introduction to the Sendai Framework. You will need to re-register. But now, since we have your email addresses, Chanda or myself will send an email with the registration link, and you can join through that. But at the same time, if you know anyone else who would benefit from these sessions, please go ahead and share the link when you get it from us. Thanks again, Stefan. Any final words before we end?
But no, just thank you very, very much for allowing me to share, and I hope people find benefit. Please give us some feedback if you want, if it's useful, or even if it's not useful, let us know, because as I said, I'm sort of talking about my thoughts on this, so always good to get feedback from people. Thank you very much.
Yes, and we will email out a survey at some point also, and this session is recorded and it will be put on YouTube, and we will share that link with the participants as well. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you everyone for joining. Hope to see you again on the 20th of April. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.